because when Ellen and I were Sunday school teachers, Ro was in our class. So we taught Ro, and now Ro is going to teach us, which is the best thing about teaching. Her topic today is a provocative title, Joseph and the Princess Dress, Gender Roles in the Bible. And it's all yours, Ro.
Okay, so as a student at Kenyon College, we had a very large Episcopal contingent because Kenyon used to be an Episcopalian seminary. And so in like sort of re-entering a new community, a new Episcopal community, I met a lot of other trans Christians who were sort of grappling with their identities with that, because a lot of the way that currently queerness and Christianity are talked about, it's very separated. And so we were all together trying to sort of square being trans and being Christian in sort of a world where we're sort of culturally post thing.
It's Rosalie.
Things sort of post the Westboro Baptist Church getting a lot of pop culture ground and that kind of thing, which sort of made one feel like you couldn't be trans and Christian. One of the things that a friend of mine found that really helped me and several of my friends with that was a program by Peterson Tuscano, who actually then went on to visit our school. So I'm going to give a quick introduction for him, a quick introduction for the specific clip that I'm going to show, and then I'm going to show the clip and we can discuss. So Peterson Tuscano is a Quaker, playwright, actor, Bible scholar, climate and gay rights activist, and blogger who has been performing one-man comedies since the early 2000s. His first performance work, Time in the Homo Nomo Halfway House, premiered in 2003, recounted his experiences with ex-gay conversion therapy, including residential programs like Love in Action. He has since gone on to produce work involving his biblical scholarship, including the book The Amazing Adventures of the Afterbirth of Jesus, writings in the anthologies Gender Outlaws, The Next Generation, and Rainbow in the Word, LGBTQ Christian Memoirs, and perhaps most prominently his performance series Transfigurations, Transgressing Gender in the Bible, which we'll be watching a part of today. Since 2014, his performance focus has shifted to web content and discussing queer reactions to climate change. Transfiguration specifically takes stories from both the Hebrew and Christian scriptures of biblical figures who transgress and transcend gender in their historical and cultural context, which he is knowledgeable about as a biblical scholar. Today we'll be watching the story of Joseph as told by his uncle Esau. And there is some context given beforehand and afterhand as Peterson, and then there's a performance that he does as Esau.
In the Bible, Esau is portrayed as this hairy guy, like super hairy, outdoorsman, hunter kind of guy, leads with his gut. He's off, he'll come in from a hunt saying, "Feed me, I'm so hungry." Well, his brother, Jacob, on the other hand, maybe his twin, but not his identical twin. He was very smooth, it says in the text. We learn a lot about his body, not a lot of body hair. He was very sensitive in his temperament, it said. And he didn't go out and hunt like his brother. Instead, he dwelt amongst the tents with the women. And in fact, while his brother Esau was out hunting, Jacob was a fabulous cook. And it's interesting, you actually don't see a lot of cooking by men in the Bible. I mean, you have Jacob doing it, and then you have men offering burnt offerings unto the Lord, kind of like a holy barbecue to God. But in the Hebrew Bible, there's almost no male preparing food like this. Now, in the Christian Bible, you do have Jesus doing some food preparation. Like there's like large-scale catering that he does, like multitudes. And then there's that like fish fry towards the end, post-resurrection. But actually preparing a meal, that's exclusively for females. So you have Esau, you have Jacob. There are these two brothers, gendered differently. Now, Jacob clearly is heterosexual in the way he partners with people and has multiple sexual partners and lots of children. But he's gendered differently, and he has a very special son, a famous son, Joseph. Joseph is very different from his brothers. There's some interesting gender differences I've noticed about Joseph. And in fact, there's one thing I noticed in the Hebrew that I didn't see in English. And so I want to share with you the story of Joseph and reveal this mystery about him in the text. I'll weave it into the performance. And to change the perspective a little bit, I want a different person to tell the story. I want to see the story of Joseph from the perspective of his uncle Esau, the big, burly, masculine guy. Let's see what he has to say about him. Yeah, I'm Esau. You probably know my brother Jacob, although he went and changed his name to Israel. We're twins, Jacob and me, although you never know by looking at us. I mean, I'm a real man. I'm big, I'm hairy. I'm always out in the field doing real men's work. Well, my brother, Jacob, he's as smooth as a woman. He was very sensitive growing up. He liked to dwell amongst the tents with the women. They're cooking, they're gossiping, they're scheming. He was a real girly boy. And since I was normal, well, our father Isaac, well, he favored me. Now, don't get me wrong, although my brother was a girly boy, he liked the women, okay? In fact, he had 2 wives and slept with both their handmaidens. And from those women, he had a pack of children, daughters, sons, strong, strapping young men, all of them. Yeah, except for one of his youngest, Joseph. This kid. He was trouble from the day he was born, always crying, clinging to his mother, and then he didn't want to go out to do real men's work. And then he started having these dreams, these crazy dreams he told everyone about. Listen, boys are not supposed to dream. So one day I pulled my brother aside. I said, listen, you gotta do something to this kid. Toughen him up. It's a rough world. They're just gonna ride right over him. But does he listen to me? No. He gives him everything he wants, including that robe. Oh, listen. I would want nothing to do with a robe like that. For one, too expensive for my taste. A royal garment, the kind of garment that a king would give to his virgin daughter. It was a princess dress. Yeah, my brother Jacob, he gave his son Joseph a princess dress, and that kid, he put that dress on. He flitted about the compound like he was some kind of butterfly. And I thought, this is not gonna end well. Sure enough, one day when the boys were out in the field doing real men's work, Jacob sent Joseph to go check on them, and that kid, no sense in his head. He puts on the stupid dress, goes traipsing across the countryside, making fools out of all of us. His brothers, they saw him in the distance. Who could miss him in that getup? And they said, enough of this dreamer. And they rushed him. They threw him to the ground. They beat him black and blue, trying to beat some sense into him. Then they ripped off the stupid dress, tore it to pieces, defiled it in blood, and came back with a bloody garment and a story about how their brother was attacked by a wild beast. That's all that remained. But later they pulled me aside. They told me what really happened, how they sold their brother to some trader going off to Egypt, sold him as a slave. And I thought, well, maybe it's all for the best. I mean, I'm a shepherd. You know, when you got a weak lamb, you got to take it out. It's just going to bring the rest of them down. And besides, the kid might do okay for himself there in Egypt land, where they go in for the whole girly boy thing. Well, through the years, I didn't give him a second thought. I mean, who's got time to mourn? Then we had that drought, famine. You know, it comes in cycles. You just gotta be man enough to ride it out, but this time was different. It was like the earth was cursed against us year after year. It got so bad we finally sent the boys to Egypt to get some grain. Not to beg. We don't beg from no one. But they were brought before some high official in Pharaoh's court, and at first they couldn't tell what it was, a man or a woman with the headdress and the makeup, the flowing robes. Those Egyptians. Turns out, it was their very own brother, Joseph. Somehow that girly boy worked his way up through the ranks to become second in command of the whole kingdom, but they didn't recognize him under all that gunk. Now this was Joseph's chance to get back at his brothers, to get his revenge. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You don't let anyone ride over you. But does he? No. Not that girly boy. He goes off weeping like a woman, and then he comes back to try to teach his brothers a lesson. And then he forgives them and he reconciles with them. He gives them food, he gives them shelter. He treats them like he's their sister or their mother, not like any man that I've ever seen. And in so doing, that girly boy, my nephew, Joseph, he saved us all. Now, I don't know about you, but I always cry when I hear the Joseph story. I mean, it's a very moving narrative, and the way it's constructed, it's really very powerful. What we're looking at is the story of a blended family. There are multiple mothers and multiple children, and there's a lot of tension in the story about inheritance rights. Who's going to get all this stuff? And some of the older brothers fall out of favor, and then there's a shift that happens because young Joseph comes along, and the brothers begin to get worried because he's the favored son. And Joseph's a bit of a brat at times. I mean, he's very precocious, so he lords it over his brothers. He's very verbal, linguistic, and he's always telling these stories in dreams. And then, to make matters worse, Jacob gives Joseph this garment. Now, in English translations, it's sometimes translated as a coat of many colors, or a robe with long sleeves. But if you look at a study Bible, there's often a note at the bottom, and it says the exact meaning of the Hebrew word is unclear. That scholars are not exactly sure what this garment was that Jacob gave to Joseph. So, if you're going to do some Bible scholarship, you have to ask, well, what is the word in Hebrew, and where else does it appear in the text? Because that can give us some light about what it might mean. The word is actually a very short phrase. It's ketonet pasim. Jacob gave Joseph a ketonet pasim. And if you look in the book of Genesis, that phrase appears nowhere else at all. It's just the story of Joseph, that he gets the garment from his father, that his brothers ultimately rip off of him and tear to pieces. So you say, okay, well, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, has lots of books to it. Surely ketonet pasim appears somewhere else in it. And if you look through the entire Old Testament, this phrase does not appear anywhere else except in 2 Samuel, a story about King David. It's actually a story about King David's daughter, Tamar, and it's a terrible story of sexual violence and of rape and what happens in a family and a nation when people don't take that crime seriously. In the story, David's got multiple wives and sexual partners, and lots of half-brothers and sisters are formed. And at one point in the story, Tamar is tricked by her half-brother, lured into his rooms, and she is raped. And in a sign of mourning, she rents her garment. She tears her clothing. And in the text, it says that the princess Tamar is wearing a ketonet pasim. But then it goes on to define it for us. The garment worn by the virgin daughters of the king. A princess dress. Now, I can just imagine some traditional male scholar, looking at the Genesis account, looking at the 2 Samuel account, and concluding the exact meaning of the Hebrew word is unclear. I mean, we have no idea what it could mean. Anything. Actually, no. If you have any intellectual integrity, you have to admit that one possible interpretation is that Jacob gave his son this female garment. It doesn't have to be the only interpretation. It doesn't have to be the one that you agree with, but it needs to be on the table because it's in the text. And if we follow through on this interpretation for a moment, suddenly the story takes on a whole new light. When the brothers, who already have issues with Joseph, see him in public wearing the ketonet pasim, they get irrationally violent, and they do violence against him and the garment. And yeah, they used it as a clever ruse to trick their father, but if it was such a fine garment that they were jealous about, they would have figured out a way to ditch their brother, and somebody would have gone home wearing the ketonet pasim. But no. There was something they didn't like about it. There was something transgressive. And there's something about their violence that seems punitive, like, we're going to teach you a lesson. And the violence I hear about in that story reminds me very much about violence I hear about today towards gender nonconforming people, particularly transgender people, especially transgender women of color. Horrific violence against people who are seen as different. Joseph experiences this level of violence from his own brothers. He's shipped off to Egypt, and there in Egypt, he is favored by everyone. He is a beautiful man, it says in the text, a descriptor that doesn't happen often with men. But even so, he does get into trouble at one point in the story, and he goes to jail. But even in the all-male prison population, he rises to the top. And then this moment comes when his brothers appear before him. He's second in command of the kingdom at this point, and they don't recognize him. They've come as climate migrants looking for food in a drought. And there they are, assembled before him. He's in full Egyptian drag. Now he has the right to crush them. If he was like any other man in the family, that's what he was taught: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But he doesn't. He acts in an extremely different way than most men would in his family. He tries to teach them a lesson. He forgives them. He reconciles with them. He becomes like the matriarch of the family, bringing them all together. Not that a man can't do this sort of thing, but back then in that family, you didn't see that modeled. So what Joseph does, he expands the way that a man can respond to conflict. And as a result, I see him as an extremely important gender nonconforming character.
So that was the text, that was the video. And so if anyone has any particular reactions they'd like to share, I also have prompts if we don't form our own discussion. But reactions, comments, questions.
This is Fred Miller. I wonder what you think that the tribe that Joseph would have had was split. And Joseph, the name of Joseph as a tribe kind of went away.
Sorry, can you expand?
The tribe became Manasseh and Ephraim, or Ephraim, however you like to pronounce that, and the tribe of Joseph. You know, there were 12 tribes of Israel, and Joseph went away. All the others are named, but Joseph went away.
Question.
Isn't
Joseph stay in Egypt? And, so he had a lucrative position there. So I always assumed that he stayed in Egypt, and his family, if he had any, was Egyptian.
Did he have children? We have no idea.
I don't believe there's record of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is also very possible that although he forgives them, and I believe that Peterson Toscano is in that moment saying that he becomes the matriarch for like in that moment of forgiveness, but that does not necessarily mean that he is reintegrating himself back into the clan. He can forgive them and still not return to them.
I thought Ephraim and Manasseh were his boys. I thought they were his sons.
Yes.
So he did have children.
Either Bob Coleman here. I'm just wondering if there are any other similarly transgressive figures in the Old Testament.
So there are. The Transfigurations stories include, I don't have the study guide up right at the second, but they include, I believe, 3 stories from the Old Testament, and then 2 stories from the New, and specifically from the Gospels, and then Acts. And the one in Acts actually goes back and references something from Isaiah, I believe, and it is a eunuch reading this section that is not usually, even at the time, interpreted to be relevant to someone who is a eunuch. And in that way is sort of what Peterson Toscano is doing with transformations is someone who is not considered the person that the audience of the text is connecting with sort of the underlying meaning. So I don't have it on hand right now, but there is a program that is about an hour long of these.
In
That
some
includes
circles,
more.
in some circles, there are references to David and Jonathan
Yes.
as loving one another beyond women.
Yeah, I think I'm more familiar with more stories of gay and lesbian possible relationships, right? King David and Jonathan and Naomi, and who's Naomi? Ruth, right? So the possibility of same-sex love, I think, is much more there in the Bible. So Ronan, if you do have those other trans stories, that'd be really fascinating to hear about, or if you can tell us where to go find them.
Yeah, the last one that full DVD with that, but
The interwebs.
in the Palm Sunday story, because traditionally at that time the cultural value was that was, oh, sorry about my internet connection if I'm breaking up, but at the time that was women's work, that carrying water was women's work. And so Peterson Toscano is speculating when in that monologue, but he creates this story of someone who is trying to connect with their family during Passover, who is taking on this feminine role that is not accepted for that. And that is why they have space for them for Palm Sunday and for Passover. So to me, it was a deeply moving story, and it is speculative, but because of that transgressive gender moment that is in the text, that is this man carrying a pitcher of water, it takes on this sort of new perspective, and he is putting sort of padding around it, but it is there. It is a possible reading.
So I've never heard of the Ketonat Passim. I'm not surprised that it was not included in my Old Testament classes at Yale. But when he said that, aside from the usual sibling rivalry brothers thing, then it made sense. That's all I have to say about that.
I agree. An interesting aspect that I certainly didn't know anything about it, but it's nice to hear that it's in the Bible.
You know, there are scholars who in evaluating the story of Jesus curing the manservant of the centurion, that the language used for the manservant could also be used for a lover. And that's why the centurion goes to Jesus in secret, because he doesn't want to be outed. And Jesus cures him. So it's, and that's something that most of us weren't taught in our Sunday school classes or scripture study either. Just saying.
In studying cultural anthropology, which I did take in college, the prevalence of very sensitive gay individuals in simpler cultures, for instance, in some places in Africa, you know, they're often found a role for them in society. They would join the group of shamans or something else where they could interpret situations, and they could not be required to be hunters and not be required to create more children so that the tribe can survive. So, you know, this has happened since forever, and it certainly happened in ancient Jewish culture, but most often then, and certainly even today, that stuff is just not talked about. You may recognize somebody with these certain characteristics. They played a different role in the tribe or society. People said just do that, but really the focus is on the warriors and producing more generations. So it clearly was there. It's just interesting to find a realistic interpretation of a recognition of this. I mean, this makes total sense to me.
What was interesting to me was the very male response. Why not just, oh, my brother, he's such a loser? No, the response, as it is today in many cases, was violence. We must beat him up, kill him, pound him into the ground. The male mind, if I may, has an interesting response. Women don't respond that way to difference, do they? I mean, am I missing a whole part of this?
I think
I wouldn't let women off the hook.
Oh,
I
I
don't
think middle
see
school
women
mean
beating up
girls can be,
mean.
Yeah, it is differently shown, but I think the classic, you know, Mean Girls high school, middle school experiences may not be physical violence in most cases, but there is, and I don't know that it's, you know, sexual gender issues, but I think it's the difference. There's plenty of it.
Well, I mean, on the gender issue thing, the Black women who suffer so horribly, are women beating them up or are men beating them up?
so. Physical violence, what tends to get talked about is violence of usually male, usually sexual partners, especially directed against trans women of color, because there is an exploration that one has to or a sexual relationship with a trans person, where you have to sort of examine what this does to how you think about your own sexuality. If you believe that you're 100% straight, but you're having sex with a trans person, how does that affect you emotionally, especially because a lot of people are attached to their concept of being straight. However, a lot of the things that you see, particularly coming out of the UK, and then also things like what was going on in North Carolina, bathroom bills, or being concerned about pressuring trans children into being trans by affirming them when they say that they want to be a boy or a girl and letting them dress how they like and calling them the name that they say they want to be called by. All of those things tend to be spearheaded, or at the very least sort of propagated or talked about or written about by women. That's sort of how on internet culture, if you hear the term TERF, it means trans exclusionary radical feminist, which is a sort of, I think, since ditched for the most part term that a lot of people who are sort of appropriating feminist language in order to exclude trans women particularly, and sort of forget that trans men exist and non-binary people exist. But in trying to exclude trans women from spaces and in trying to limit how trans children are able to exist in the world, those groups tend to be usually focused on and run by women. That tends to be who that's coming from, and it tends to be more bureaucratic in nature.
Under the guise of protecting straight children.
Yes, or protecting the trans children in case they regret it later, from making any permanent decisions which aren't made until the child is potentially starting puberty, and even then that's not fully permanent usually. It's one of those things where it's actually usually not no risk, but probably safer for the child's emotional health in the long run to accommodate and discuss with them and involve them, and not just say, no, we're gonna ignore you until need be. Which is, I think, something that's sort of explored in this, in Jacob being sort of, in a way, affirming by providing this ketonet pasim, and everyone else responding, no, we need to make you not want this anymore. And then as soon as Joseph has left that environment and gone into an environment that is affirming of people who make that choice, and also people who don't necessarily make the choice of wearing lots of makeup and wearing a headdress and that kind of thing, Joseph immediately sort of embraces that, which is sort of something that I think needs to be kept in mind by people who are trying to sort of train specific gender performance from a child. If you want them to act like a boy, forcing them to act like a boy if they don't particularly want to do that isn't going to make them not want to be a boy. Like,
Ro, if I can ask, it seems to me that we all bring the full force of who we are when we interpret a text, including the biblical text. And you've given us an example of maybe how you, as a trans person, use the biblical text, but I'm wondering if you could speak about that in more broad terms. Do you see the Christian scriptures as sort of an adversarial thing that has to be interpreted and sort of defanged? Or how do you see it, I guess, and how do you interpret the text given who you are?
I tend to see it as sort of similarly to folk tales of, there is a root of something that I can connect to now in my day-to-day life. But it also has all of the trappings of this sort of long history and this historical background that I may not fully understand right now, and that because historical projects are always sort of looking back, they're never, or for the most part, they are not from the current, like, you can't get someone from Joseph's era and like ask them questions about it and like that kind of thing, because you're never going to know for certain, because you're never going to have been there. I think that there's a lot of interpretation and there's a lot of unsurety that I am sort of okay with. I'm sort of fine not necessarily knowing. I try to do research and I try to look into it and that kind of thing. But if there's sort of nothing but speculation, I'm okay with that. And I just sort of look for an interpretation that seems to fit. So for example, this one, like that Peterson Tuscano is sort of going a little out there in terms of the possible interpretations that a lot of people have accepted, but it has evidence in the text, it has support in the text. And so I'm willing to use this one, particularly because it does bring sort of an immediacy to the story for me, in a way that it might not for others, but in a way that I find sort of brings me closer to the story, and I think adds a layer of transgression, not just in how someone dresses, but also how someone acts. What do you value, and how is that gendered? How do we view different values as being masculine or feminine? And so I try to find the way that, and this is a little like, it doesn't sound very academic, but I try to find the way that stories can best guide me through the world and best emotionally and mentally help me, that also feels secure. It doesn't feel super shaky. And then just work with that as best I can, which is a lot of stumbling in the dark, but what else is faith? But a little bit of stumbling in the dark and a whole lot of hope.
Ronan, you seem to be saying that the Holy Spirit doesn't necessarily play according to our rules.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we've heard that before.
Ronan, how did you come across this presentation? What drew you to this particular work?
So a friend of mine, Jess, is was a biology major, is now, I believe, on sabbatical, or not sabbatical, but on sort of a break in between graduating college and going to veterinary school, but is also looking into discernment and going to seminary, and has been sort of squaring with, they were raised in a extremely strict Lutheran tradition that they ultimately ended up leaving, in part because they're trans, and they started going to the Episcopal Church on campus, but were very called to Christ, and so was working on discernment, that kind of thing, and found Peterson Tuscano, really connected with the performances, and would show everyone who they knew who was trans in the church. They would just show anyone a Peterson Tuscano video, and eventually, because they worked with the church, and they were one of the, I don't know if they were one of the vestry members, but they were involved in the on-campus, the student group, the Episcopal student group. They, through that, brought Peterson Tuscano to campus. And so he also gave performances that were sort of clipped from each of his different one-man comedy shows and performance shows. So he did something from the Homo Nomo Halfway House. He did something from Transfigurations. He did a lot of that kind of thing.
Where does he come from?
So he currently lives in, I believe, Sunbury, PA.
Wow.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to add that he's spoken at Dickinson many times. And so for people who are interested in seeing him live, if we're ever back in person and having large gatherings, I assume that he'll be coming back. I don't know if he was an alum or if he took some classes with us, but he definitely has some strong relationships with folks in sociology and American studies. So he gets invited regularly. So I think he was here last in 2017 and before that in 2015. So he's around in our area and doing talks that are often open to the public.
Yeah. And he also recently, he's been doing lots of Zoom meetings. He's been also doing sort of, I think, consults on how to best do Zoom performances and Zoom meetings and that kind of thing, particularly for pandemic and social distancing. So he's become like because he has worked on web content in the past, he is trying to also disseminate that information right now. So that's sort of been a recent shift of his that I've seen specifically on his website. But he's gone to a bunch of US and UK colleges. He's spoken at a bunch of conferences, particularly.
Lost you again, dear.
Based performances, although I know that he's also done lectures. There are two different versions of transformations. There are two different versions of transformations, one of which is the monologue version like we saw, and another one which is strictly the lecture style.
The depth of theological understanding presented in such an entertaining way was just a delight.
I agree. It really brought it to life.
It was very affirming, I think, of the subject, and it's nice. It's encouraging to hear that from the Bible, that interpretation.
So I actually watched this before when we were wondering if this would be appropriate for Sunday Forum, but then seeing it again, each time you read something or see something, you pick something a little different out. And the part that I picked out this time was the de-escalation part. So just with all the events going on around, the country, that we keep on escalating violence in response to often peaceful protests, sometimes not so peaceful protests. And, that I know that's something that gets struggled with in any conflict, right? Is okay, this conflict's starting, how do we sort of ratchet it back down? And I just found that interesting in this story, that was Joseph's response when he could have certainly had the opportunity and the ability to crush his brothers. He de-escalated the conflict.
It's interesting that the Egyptians were accepting us and his family was not.
It's kind of depressing that they interpret it as a matriarchal response. Definitely not patriarchal. Oh, gotta learn.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that actually Peterson brings up in his study guide for the program is the fact that not only is Esau's response to Joseph based in how he looks and how he dresses, but also in how he acts and how he values. And something that I've sort of been thinking about and talking about, and lots of my friends who are philosophy majors or political science majors have been talking about, are the concepts of communities of strength and communities of vulnerability, where communities of strength are, what can you do to us? What strengths are you bringing to our community that you can then use for the sake of the community? And if you have those, we will take you. Versus communities of vulnerability are, what do you need from the community to provide for you so that we can all support each other? And so those political philosophies are sort of underlying things that you can sort of see in how people talk about different philosophies. So a community of strength will, or something that sort of comes from this concept of a community of strength, it would be, what can immigrants do for us? So we're going to give them a specific type of test, or they need to be able to speak English, or we're only going to accept them if they're doctors. Versus a community of vulnerability would be, if you are seeking asylum, we will take you because we know that you need that. or we are going to support you if you cannot financially support yourself right now, because eventually we will all be in a situation where we're one paycheck away from homelessness or that kind of thing. And it is very important that we all sort of take care of ourselves, like take care of each other, because then we will need that care given to us eventually. And so this makes me think about, and maybe it's just because I've got politics on the brain and that's why it comes up, but this specific video has made me think about that a lot recently, of which of those are perceived as being manly or desirable, and how that therefore, like how specifically associating valuing strength or valuing providing support for vulnerable people might change, like, or how you associate those two things with gender might affect how you respond to something like that. So if you see providing for the vulnerable as a feminine thing and you are very attached to your masculinity, you might sort of eschew providing for the vulnerable or that kind of thing. You might feel uncomfortable with that and struggle with that. And so that's been something that I've sort of been thinking about a lot. I don't know if I'm just completely rambling about nothing, but that's sort of been something that's on my mind.
I think part of it is your differences in, I've got to be independent, I've got to be strong, and the sense of community, which is inclusiveness, forgiveness, just a loving approach as opposed to an independent approach.
Yeah, if I could follow up, there's so much that's been written now on competing senses of masculinity having to do with the election we're having. And I think it's very, very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Stop there before we get into the areas maybe that are untoward. But I think we'd be a lot better off if we thought more about justice and less about masculinity. Maybe this could something that would be a common denominator. But I wanted to ask you, Ro, a little bit different kind of a question. And you sort of alluded to this earlier, but as a young trans person, is it difficult simultaneously also to be religious, to be devout, or to want to explore that sort of devotion? Yeah, I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it can be a little isolating sometimes, because a lot of the queer community has experienced exclusion based on transness or queerness in some kind. And so they don't necessarily want to talk about religion or faith, even if they are like spiritual or that kind of thing. They don't really want to examine how, or they don't want to talk theology with you. And so, like, which is very understandable, and you want to respect that. But at the same time, that means that you feel a little isolated from them sometimes if you're having like a little bit of a, like if your current mini crisis is a crisis relating to faith, you're not going to really want to talk about it with them. However, you're also sort of navigating the world of religion in a way that's a little bit different from all of the people who aren't queer around you. And while that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't help each other, that does mean that sometimes you want support from people who, like, don't need to have your experience explained to them. Like, they'll be like, yes, I got you. I've done that too. I've been there too. You can say this thing is happening and they'll go, oh yeah, I get that. But so like that was part of why I really valued the friendships that I had with Jess and with my friend Iris, was in part because we were all sort of going through the same stuff together. But something that, and like a community specifically that I've sort of found a little bit of a home with is, even though I have not had any experience with capital E evangelical churches, is with what's considered the ex-evangelical community, and specifically the queer contingent of that, because many of those people had to leave their churches because their churches were not affirming, and therefore had to entirely leave sort of their faith background because of their queerness. But that doesn't mean that they're not religious anymore. So they sort of had to create their own community, and many of them have since become either Episcopalian or Methodist or Lutheran. And so we have similar liturgical and theological beliefs. And also, while I don't have necessarily the same tension with my home religion and home church as they do, I still have witnessed the exclusion of queer people from churches, and that actually initially makes you very nervous when you are a queer person in a church, is that you don't know right off the bat. And affirming statements like those in the bulletin and those on our website and that kind of thing are very important in this, are very important in countering this. But because those weren't available for a very long time, there is a lot of unsurety for people who aren't straight or aren't cisgender when initially going to a church for the first time, or meeting with members of a church, or coming out of, is this going to change how this church relates to me? Is this going to change how the church treats me? Is the church going to be affirming of me? And in that, there is a lot of tension. So it's a little bit lonely because you can't quite fit in perfectly with one community or the other, but that does mean that you sort of all gravitate together, even if you don't have the exact same experience in the faith.
Can I add something too? So I'm neither young nor trans, I'm middle-aged and queer, but you know, I think that there's a lot of similarities with LGBTQ people and kind of trans experience, where you just don't feel like there's a real set home. And I feel like I'm always hiding a small piece of myself in each different community that I'm with. Like, I'm never sure at church how much to be open about my trans partner and, you know, the rest of my family configuration. And I'm never sure when I'm with my queer friends how much they want to hear about church, because like Ronan's been saying, there's a lot of complicated history, right? And hurt. And even though I grew up in the Episcopal Church, my Episcopal Church preached against homosexuality from the pulpit, right? It was very, very conservative and really anti-gay and anti-women in a lot of places. So I think that it's not that the Episcopal Church is always everywhere more welcoming, but that's a big thing that I liked about being here, is seeing those welcoming statements that we have, seeing the trans flag and the queer flag flying at St. Stephen's. Like, these are all things that make it feel like a more welcoming and open place for folks like us.
Rona?
Yes?
I can't be the only one who has admired you from afar forever. And I'm a little weepy just watching you here. You are so courageous. Your parents are so justifiably proud of you. Can you give us a little hint to what the next step in your fabulous road is? Would you run for president, for instance? I'd vote for you.
I'm not sure about a presidency. I feel like I put my foot in my mouth just a little too often to be comfortable with running for president. But I'm end goal is to go into specifically specifically childcare and hopefully psychology, counseling, and it's a little uncertain right now exactly how I'm going to go about doing that, but I am also interested in potentially involving myself in politics, making a nuisance of myself at the very least at council meetings, that kind of thing. But yeah, I'm a little bit stumbling my way through at the moment, but as of right now, I'm working at Harrisburg Academy with my mom, and I'm getting to work with like the kind of kids in the age group that I want to work with for the rest of my life. So I'm like satisfied and like looking forward, but not quite sure yet.
Good for you.
Well, I hate to say it, but our time has come to an end, and I want us to thank Ronan. That was terrific and very interesting and wonderful. So thanks, Ronan, for being so brave. Next week, Melina Desbot is going to come, who is our seminarian, and talk about her journey and so that we can get to know her. The week after, the Sycamore House will present themselves via video, so we know who they are. And then after that, I'm actually going to hazard a 3-week series, which I'm calling What Money Can't Buy, because I'm going to steal liberally from the Michael Sandel book by the same name, which is just about the way in which our world today puts cash value on things that maybe it shouldn't. And maybe we should, as Christian people, especially rethink that a little bit. So more on that later. But thanks for coming. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend. And again, thanks to you, Ro. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you.
What's going on with you, Anthony?